Hello and welcome to a special edition of Mr. C History. I'm not walking around, I'm in my usual environment, the classroom, to focus in on my bread and butter, the GCSE course. And today, in fact, we're going to be focusing in on the Cold War. I will be doing more videos revising the content of this. I've already made a video before about the skills. Please do make sure you watch this. These next few videos over the next few weeks will focus on the key part of the GCSE course. Whichever GCSE course you do, please make sure you check. If you are not one of my students, or if you are looking at this in another way, different exam boards do different things, for example, but I'm hoping that you would still find this useful as a guide to what happened in the Cold War. We've got lots to get through, so let's start. First of all, start with the name of our course. Our course is called A World Divided Superpower Relations, and the years that we study are 1943 to 1972. Some Cold War courses go on later, some start a bit later, etc., etc. But the one I want to focus in on is this. Please note as well that the words Cold War actually don't appear in the title of this course. So when you go and sit down and take your exam, and you look at the bit of the exam that focuses on you, don't be looking for the phrase Cold War, be looking for the phrase superpower relations. That's very, very important. I'm sure we've seen the Rocky films where there's Dolph Lundgren representing the Soviet Union faces Rocky Balboa in the clash of the Cold War. This is a bit like what the Cold War was about. We had the Soviet Union versus the United States of America, the communist Soviet Union versus the capitalist United States of America, where they were fighting ideologically, but they never actually struck blows to each other. No Soviet soldier fought no American soldier really in any great conflict. They sort of got other people to do the fighting. But before we do that, we need to break down the ideology of this. We've got American capitalism. What does that mean? People are free to make as much money as they want. Factories are owned by individuals, etc. Government shouldn't interfere in your life as little as possible. There are free elections and free press. It is a free democracy, capitalism, and it's America and its allies. Soviet communism is very, very different. Their belief would be that the rich are the elite, are wicked and selfish, and they should be forced to share their wealth. Factories and properties should be owned by the state, by the government on behalf of the people, and give it back to the people. Communist government would get involved in all aspects of your life, from health to education to providing you a job, to militaristic, to education, to what's on the television, to what car you drive, etc., etc. At elections, should people only be allowed to vote or choose communists? Of course, in America, you can choose whoever you want, theoretically. The press in the Soviet Union, communism, should never criticize the government and is controlled. And very importantly here, religious belief for communism should not exist. Christianity, etc., Orthodoxism, Buddhism, Islam, not be tolerated. The main religion is communism. Must be quickly shared though. Both countries are huge, loads of resources. In fact, the Soviet Union is the only country in the world where every single element of the periodic table is available. And it was oil rich, and so was America, etc., etc., huge populations. And both countries felt that their system was the best. And indeed, they were willing to die and fight in order to protect it. Okay, so our course, as I said, started in 1943, which is in the middle of the Second World War. So what were relations like in the Second World War? I put a picture of Churchill here just because that's exciting. But at the beginning of our Cold War course, it is important to talk about Britain. They wane in significance and importance as we go along, but they're worth talking about at the moment. So actually, amazingly, during World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States of America were on the same side. They had a common enemy. That common enemy, of course, was Nazi Germany, fascism in Europe. And so the USSR, Soviet Union, invaded Nazi Germany. Indeed, Nazi Germany invaded them. The Americans obviously invaded at Normandy at the D-Day landings. So they were fighting for a common cause. Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt indeed met. So these are the leaders of the three most powerful countries at the time. Churchill, leader of Britain. Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, leader of the United States of America. They first met in 1943 in Tehran, in Iran, just south of the Soviet Union, a long way for Roosevelt to go. And in this meeting, they discussed three things. They said that USA and Britain would open up a second front in Germany. Essentially, they would invade D-Day, Normandy landings. Fine. The USSR also said they would declare war on on Japan once Germany had been defeated. Spoiler alert, Stalin does not do that, much to Roosevelt's successor, Truman's chagrin. But we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. The USSR would also gain some land from Poland, but that Poland would gain some from Germany, and then indeed Poland would be free in itself, because that was a big part of the cause of the Second World War, of course, the Nazi invasion of Poland. A wall of writing here, but it's worth talking about this nonetheless. I mentioned there the Tehran conferences. Key part of the exam course is for you to know the other key conferences that took place in 1945. The first one took place in February of 1945. The second took place in July of 1945. So they're progressive. And it's important to talk about that time. February 1945, Hitler not yet dead, Germany not yet defeated. July of 45, Hitler's dead, Germany's defeated, Japan about to be defeated. So only a few short months, but the course of the war is extremely significant at that time. Yalta then, the first meeting. Yalta is in the Soviet Union. It is in modern-day Crimea, hotly debated place where that is now, but they meet there first and foremost. And the people who meet there are the same as Tehran: Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. The key problem is Roosevelt is very ill. Spoiler alert, a few months later, he dies. So he's very ill. He had polio, etc. Churchill also didn't trust Stalin. There's a big famous story at the Yalta conference where Churchill had a cigar and he put a piece of wire in his cigar, and the ash clung to it. And the Soviets went mad and they were going crazy. And he did it to play mind games with Stalin because he didn't trust him. And Stalin is obsessed with just getting what he wants with the USSR. So their relations are slightly frosty. What did they agree on? And this is important for you to know. They agreed that the borders of Poland would be altered in the way we described earlier. They agreed that free elections would be held in Poland. Stalin perhaps crossed his fingers while that took place. Germany would be reduced in size and would have to pay money back, reparations, and would also be divided into occupied zones. They also agreed, very importantly, to set up the United Nations, the first of which, of course, you saw in the Cold War video I made, took place in London. And Stalin and the USA had different views on these free elections. That was the key problem with Yalta. Fast forward a few months to Potsdam, and things are very different. Potsdam is a suburb of Berlin, so they've taken this seat of power away from the Germans, of course, very, very symbolic. But there are some key replacements. Stalin is still there, he carries on for ages. But as I said, Roosevelt is dead, replaced by his vice president, Harry S. Truman. The S, of course, stands for nothing. His parents couldn't decide what his middle name should be, so they said he just got the middle name S, extraordinarily. And Churchill is no longer there. He's not dead. He was booted out. I gave Hitler the boot, and the people give me the boot, is what he said. And he was replaced by a new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who was a bit more focused on Britain, NHS, education. His international affairs, a little bit of a distraction, he felt, for him. Anyway, so the personnel has changed. Stalin seizes opportunity to push for yet more. So what do they do? Well, they set up a council for foreign ministers to organize the rebuilding of Europe, of which the European Union emerges. They agree on how much money Germany should pay. It is a lot, and they don't finish paying it until 2010. They detail the 4 zones that Germany was going to be divided into, which we'll look at in a minute. They also agree that the Nazi Party should be stamped out in all sectors of Germany and that surviving Nazis should be prosecuted. They set up the Nuremberg trials, how to deal with the Nazis. A very, very interesting point, that one. So, frosty meetings, and Stalin takes an opportunity to inveigle even more. Germany is defeated, and Nazi Germany had taken a lot of Eastern Europe. So the Germans have now retreated, well, that's until they've lost. And the Soviets had marched all the way from Moscow to Berlin to get themselves there. Now, everybody thought, now that the Soviets have liberated these areas of Eastern Europe, they will simply go back to Moscow. But Stalin has different ideas, and he says, no, I think we'll stay around here a little bit so that he can get control of the Soviet Union. Specifically, various different areas. Now, the mindset of the Russians is very important here. They had just been invaded by the Nazis. They had had atrocities, etc. They've been invaded by Napoleon in the 100 years before, they are petrified of the great west-eastern plain of Europe that armies can maraud their way across. Stalin wants to make sure that his people are protected, that Moscow and Russia are no longer at threat from another European power. So to do that, he has to create a buffer zone of these countries, which are not technically part of the Soviet Union, but Stalin's going to force them to be communists. So essentially they do everything that he says. Technically they're independent, but please, they're absolutely not. And these countries include Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. All of those countries absolutely become communist nations. You then have this country called East Germany, which will explain a little bit more how Germany was divided up. Stalin essentially makes the bit of Germany that he was given communist. We also have these other ones, Yugoslavia and Albania, who are sort of, they dabble with communism. Albania definitely, yes, but they almost look to be more Maoist than China in the end, which is extraordinary. And Tito, Marshal Tito in Yugoslavia, sometimes dallianced with the West. Indeed, he took martial aid and he became friends with Churchill, etc. But he also became friends with Stalin to an extent. Stalin tried to kill him quite a bit, but there we go. How did they take control? Well, they forced elections. In the elections, they put pressure on any party that wasn't communist. By pressure, I mean beating them up. They sometimes had the Red Army position there, saying, if you don't vote for the communists, we'll kill you, that sort of thing. They have communist gangs and they rise it all up, control of the newspapers, the usual thing for communist dictators to have. But the main point is, after the Second World War, Stalin and the Soviet Union have control of this eastern flank of Europe. Right, next, moving on, 1946. So as I said, Churchill is out of office, but he still goes and got on a lovely lecture tour, and he goes to Fulton, Missouri, in the middle of the United States of America. And there he makes a very famous speech. It became known as the Iron Curtain speech. And in that, he says, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Eastern Europe. What he's essentially saying is there is a metaphoric iron curtain going across Eastern Europe. We go back to that map there, Stettin in the north, Trieste in the Adriatic, a wall, an iron curtain runs down there. What he means by this, of course, is that you cannot travel. You've got one side of that curtain is capitalist, one side is communist. Europe is divided in two between the Soviets and the capitalists. And he's raging and all that stuff. At the same time, various different messages are being sent around by the ambassadors for the countries to back home. The first that came out was in February 1946. This was taken by the American ambassador in Moscow. So he's living in Moscow, but he represents America as the ambassador. And he wrote a letter back to Washington saying, gosh, you can't trust these Russians. He describes Stalin as neurotic. He says there's no logic of reason. He says they're building up powers. Essentially gets everybody scared in Washington about this Stalin guy. The problem is that the Soviets intercept it and they read it. And they read that the American ambassador is beefing on them. But that sort of highbrowness or the the Soviets thinking they have the higher hand doesn't last long, because the Soviet ambassador in Washington does almost the exact same thing describing the American government, saying they want to dominate the world. They said they're not interested in the USSR at all. They want to build up their military presence, etc., etc. So the Russians did the exact same thing. Okay, so how does America react? And remember, they have a new president, Harry S. Truman, who is perhaps a little bit more aggressive than Roosevelt. Well, he created something called the Truman Doctrine. A doctrine is an idea, a policy, a foreign policy idea, how you're going to project your country across the world. To do so, he says, the world has a choice between communist tyranny and democratic freedom. America will lead the freedom, the free world, the leader of the free world, Harry S. Truman. And he says that America will send troops to protect democracy, to protect freedom. Don't, the rest of the world, with a wagging finger, says Truman, don't you be tempted to become authoritarian and to choose communism. Go instead to choose democracy. He comes up with this term, containing. He doesn't want to destroy communism. He knows that the Soviet Union is too big and too strong, even for America to do it, but he doesn't want communism to spread. This domino theory, the idea that if communism goes there, it goes to the next country. He wants to contain it. So his policy is containment, containing communism. with that, to do that, he also provides money. It's not just weapons, it's also money. Europe has been ruined by World War II, destroyed, etc. Infrastructure needs to be built again, railways, roads, all that stuff. Food. So America, which was basically unscathed from World War II, hadn't been invaded apart from Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, of course. So they said, right, here you go, Europe, have a load of money, but on one condition: you don't become communist. So Britain gleefully accepted up, thank you very much. France took quite a bit. Italy that did, although they dabbled with communism in Italy. Greece, fighting with the monarchists. They were having a real crisis of identity, Greece. But they took martial aid in the end. And in 13 billion was given, which in 1947 was a considerable amount. So America is using its wallet across Europe to defeat communism. Now, Stalin is not going to stand and let lie whilst Truman is going off sending all his money. So the Soviet Union set up their own version of all that, and that's called Cominform and Comecon. Note it's Comecon, not Comic Con. Isn't that sort of for fantasy comics and films, etc. These two, Cominform and Comecon, were places where countries could join to get information about communism and how it all works, and to receive money. And indeed, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, places like that, took money from the Soviet Union to rebuild after being invaded. How much choice they had in the matter, I'm not so sure. However, they did receive money. So the Soviet Union had their own version of martial aid and Truman Doctrine, Comecon and Comiform. One question still remains, though, and this was a big, big question that they had at the conferences. What to do with Germany? Germany, of course, had been defeated, crushed. The German government no longer exists. Nazi Germany, etc. And the first thing they did was they actually divided Germany into 4 places. Britain got this nice section near the North Sea. America got the industrial Munich, Bavarian lands. France got the French border. And what is known as East Germany was given to the Soviet Union, with an exception, which we'll talk about in a moment. But they didn't know which way to go. Obviously, the Soviet Union wanted Germany to become communist. Well, they would. The rest, France, Britain, and America said, how about no? That's not a good idea. We want it to be capitalist. In the end, we had 2 different groups, and America, France, and Britain essentially unified everything. And this became known as West Germany. And then the Soviet Union said, we're going to go on our own, create another country, East Germany. And so Germany, for many years, from 1945 right up to 1990, was divided into 2. West Germany, East Germany. Capitalist democratic West Germany, communist dictatorship, East Germany. Problem with that, though, is that Berlin, the capital of Germany, was smack bam in the middle of East Germany, the Soviet-controlled bit of Germany. Now, the Western group, America, France, and Britain, did not like that. They did not want the Soviet Union to control Berlin. So Berlin was a special case. And what they said was, and this was decided at the Potsdam Conference, that Berlin would be treated differently, that Berlin itself would be divided up into 4 as well. So you have Berlin is totally surrounded by communist East Germany. You have this tiny little pocket of freedom, of capitalism, of democracy hidden here in Berlin. So the poor people of West Berlin, surrounded by communism, by Stalin, here they were, they've got that little bit of freedom, that bit of McDonald's and Coca-Cola ready to go. As you can imagine, this causes problems, and indeed we get to know what is known as the Berlin crisis / airlift / blockade. The reason why I've said this, it has a bit of an identity crisis in itself in the exam board, but these things are essentially the same. There is another Berlin crisis coming up with the Berlin Wall, but if you see anything on crisis, airlift or blockade 1947-48, 49, you will be talking about this. What is it all about? Well, let's start with the causes of this crisis. We kind of already highlighted. One of the main causes, of course, is that Berlin is divided up. There's division between it all, etc., etc. There's also increasing disparity between the living standards. As you can imagine, martial aid is now flooding in. So the people of West Berlin are having their buildings rebuilt. They're having their railways rebuilt. They're having the bridges and all that stuff. It now looks nice. East Berlin is still a place of rubble, destroyed by World War II. The Soviets haven't quite got themselves sorted out. So the people of East Berlin are looking at West Berlin and saying, I'm going to go there because the water's running and the electricity's on, etc., etc. I'm going to move there. So that's part of the issue. There is a key spark, though. The Western group says, enough of trying to make a deal with all these Soviets. We are going to create our own currency. They create the Deutschmark, only to be used in West Germany. The East get very angry. Specifically, Stalin gets really angry, and he reacts. He reacts by blockading the whole of Berlin. He cuts off all the roads, he cuts off all the railways, he cuts off the canal, he cuts off the underground system, he cuts off the electricity, he cuts off the water supply, he cuts off everything. You cannot drive or get a train into Berlin from the Western sector. West Berlin, this tiny little pocket of capitalism, has been shut off because it is itself surrounded by Communist East. The only way in is to fly. Now, this is obviously a bit of a risk because the Western group think if we fly in, will Stalin shoot us down? But they also know that if Stalin did shoot him down, that would be an act of war, and war would break out between the Soviet Union and America. Is Stalin going to make the risk of shooting down one of the planes that are flying in to do it? Because it's very lucky that the Western sector of Berlin had 2 airports, brilliantly enough. And so they threw mission after mission, flight landing every 30 seconds. Everything had to be flown in. Gas, water, machinery, medicines, all that sort of thing was being flown in, always under the potential threat of being shot down at any time. So it goes on for 9 months or so, getting on to 10 months it goes on. Stalin never shoots down. But most importantly, West Berlin never gives in. It could have easily said, I can't be bothered with this. Fine, we'll join the communists. We'll all become one communist city surrounded in East Germany, and we'll give up all of our freedoms and our resources. No, they never do. They stick to the capitalist democracy guns, and we fly in as many missions as they do. The Soviet Union decides in May of 1949, we're going to cave in. Stalin lifts his blockade. In the first battle of the Cold War, it's 1-0 to the Americans. Right, lots of consequences then to the Berlin airlift/blockade. First and foremost, it was a propaganda coup for the West. We look great. We can defend each other. It's also the first test of this idea of containment that Truman had. He was able to contain communism. It didn't spread even further. It's a bloody nose for Stalin as well. He was been furious, etc. A negative one is it firmly now cemented the divide. There was no way back now. It was always going to be East and West Germany no matter what. And another thing, it created NATO, which we'll talk about now. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this was set up by Western nations. It's a military alliance, and their fundamental tenet belief, Article 1 of NATO says, if a NATO member is invaded by another country, all other NATO countries will join together at your defense. So some of these countries that join, Norway, Denmark, Portugal, Luxembourg, Belgium, etc. If Belgium gets invaded by the Soviet Union, every other country from Britain, America, Canada, all that stuff, has to come into their defense. It's expanded now to Estonia, little tiny Estonia, borders on Russia. If that is invaded, we all have to come to their defense. That is what NATO says. It's a pact to say we will defend you if you are under attack. How does Stalin react to this? Well, what can you imagine? He sets up his own version called the Warsaw Pact, which is the same deal. If any communist country is invaded, we will come to your defense if you're a communist. Right, let's now move into the 1950s, where the Cold War really starts to expand. So far, we've just been concentrating in Europe, but at the beginning of 1950, things expand out to Asia and into the Pacific region, specifically Korea. The Korean War starts in 1950, and this was a real key battle of the Cold War. Causes, events, consequences. Let's hear all about it. Well, the causes are essentially that during the Second World War, Korea had been invaded and controlled by Japan. Japan collapses, of course, and so now we have a power vacuum. The Soviets move into the north, capitalists into the south. So essentially you have a capitalist South Korea and you have a communist North Korea. North Korea is run by a man called Kim Il-sung. South is run by a man called Syngman-rhee. Now, Korea had for thousands of years just been one country. This is the first time it's been divided. Very alien. Same culture, same language, same people, of course. But they are at the microcosm of this capitalism versus communism. Anyway, 1950, Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans say, well, I'm going to have all of it. So he invades with his Korean troops all of South Korea very much unprepared, and the North Koreans get right down to just this little pocket at the bottom of in the Busan corner here. The North Koreans almost take all of Korea, and that would have been it all over. The Americans are having none of this, but they do something rather clever. They go to the newly formed United Nations, only 5 years old, the United Nations, and say, we need to have a resolution. We need to sort this out. Luckily, the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN at this time, so couldn't veto in the Security Council. And it does happen. The Americans managed to get a resolution passed forward saying the UN is going to defend South Korea. So importantly, it's UN troops that land in South Korea, not specifically American, although Americans make up about 80% of it. But there are British soldiers, South African soldiers. There are 2 soldiers from Luxembourg, bless, who go in and fight, which is nice. And they manage to push the communist North Koreans all the way, almost to the Yalu River, to try and take all of it. Korea almost entirely all becomes capitalist. It's on the brink, and then what happens? Our old friend, the Chinese, the communist Chinese, are just newly communist. They invade in 1951 or 52-ish, and they manage to push back to what we have now, the 38th parallel, the latitude that runs through the middle of Korea. And that is the border that still exists today, known as the DMZ, or the DMZ, of course, as we should call it, with communist North, capitalist South. The war has never ended. It still is going on today. It's just a ceasefire. Consequences. Well, the main consequence, Cold War is now in Asia. Second thing, the United Nations getting involved is quite a significant thing here. Neither side wins. It's the first time this Cold War almost becomes hot with real bullets flying, etc., etc., etc. There's a really interesting individual here as well, Douglas MacArthur. He is the main commander of the Western troops, the UN, US American. He had an extraordinary pipe. We talked about Churchill and his cigar. Douglas MacArthur had a corn cob pipe made from a piece of sweet corn dried out. He wanted to use nuclear weapons. He said to Truman, look, come on, you've dropped a bomb on Japan, why not drop one on Korea and China? Truman, perhaps to his credit, said, maybe not. That really might escalate and things pretty bad. So things are not looking great in Asia. Wrestling back to Europe, 1954, Stalin dies. Oh my goodness, especially for us who've been studying Stalin as well. But he's replaced by a new leader, a man called Nikita Khrushchev. There's a bit of a power struggle, but he emerges as a leader. This is an excellent photo of him at the United Nations. He's taken his shoe off and he's waving his shoe in anger as he goes forward to that, which is great. What does he do? Well, he made an interesting promise. He said he wanted to de-Stalinize, try and move on from the brutal, evil times of Stalin. He wanted to be less tyrannical, less of a dictator. So everybody thought, thank goodness for that, we can move on from the terrors of Stalinism. And indeed, he actually started to make overtures. He went to America, went to a baseball game, had a lovely time. There's a great picture of him really, really enjoying a hot dog. Nice guy. Things are going to be okay, aren't they? Sadly, not, especially if you're Hungarian in Eastern Europe. 1956, the Hungarian Uprising. This is a really important time in the Cold War. It comes back to Europe with a vengeance. So remember, the Soviet Union's got a new leader, and Hungary at the time was ruled by a man called Rákosi, the evil, bald butcher, he was known. Brutal dictatorship, horrible, horrible way to rule the country. Anyway, he gets pushed over, and a new chap emerges in the name of Imre Nagy, who was a communist, but he came up with these unbelievably revolutionary ideas for a communist: democracy, other political parties, relations with the West, trade unions, the free vote, free press. Oh my goodness me, the Soviets would not be happy at this. So what does they decide to do? Oh, there's a couple of other things to mention as well. Radio Free Europe, very, very important. Radio waves are really hard to intercept. And so this free radio that came from the Western world, from free Europe, from France and Germany, etc., was getting to Hungary, and they were playing Elvis Presley and all sorts of things like that. And the Hungarians were listening, saying, wow, this sounds amazing. Let's join the West. It'd be great. Wonderful. As always as well, there's a bad harvest. Show me a revolution and there's a bad harvest there. Anyway, so Nagy is there. Now, how does Khrushchev react? Remember, Khrushchev has to prove himself, this new leader. He could either say, yes, Hungary, go and be democratic, that's fine, or he could brutally crush. Can you guess what he decides to do? Brutally crush. Invading troops in, restoring order. They hang Imre Nagy, replace him with a real stooge that's keen to keep to the normal communist line. This is a message sent out to the Warsaw Pact countries. Don't mess with Khrushchev. So the three main consequences of Hungary establishes Khrushchev as a powerful leader, sends a message to other communist countries, don't mess with us, don't try and change communism. The third one, the West looks weak. Britain and America had said a few things in the United Nations saying, I think maybe Hungary should be treated, but it didn't mean anything. They didn't do anything. They didn't come to Hungary's defense. And so that it weakened the West as well. Let's talk about America now, and they do something rather silly. 1960, a man called Gary Powers was flying this airplane. It's a U-2 plane. He was flying at 60,000 feet. Specifically, he was flying over the Soviet Union. What was he doing? He was taking photographs of sort of military bases or roads and things like that. The silly fool managed to get himself shot down. Even more, he forgot to take his cyanide pill, or it got lost. Usually you're supposed to do that. And indeed, so he ejected, parachuted down, landed in the field, and he was arrested. He was paraded through the streets of the Soviet Union saying how terrible this is, put on trial, television, all that sort of stuff. It doesn't look good. The Americans are spying on the Russians. This is coming at a time, as I say, when Khrushchev was trying to make better deals, have been and watched his baseball games. All of that goes to pot now. This starts the unraveling of the 1960s and the crises that we're going to focus on now. Okay, so a real big part of the course of the 1960s is looking at three crises. The crises we're going to look at are the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Prague Spring, Czechoslovakia. Let's start on bringing on the wall, the Berlin Wall. So we just had the U-2 spy plane incident. Khrushchev's got another problem. Do you remember earlier on in this video, I was talking about how Berlin had been split up between East and the West. Stalin had tried to blockade it, didn't work. Khrushchev needs to solve that problem. He's got another additional aspect to that problem. He's losing hundreds of thousands of people a year. They're essentially fleeing communist East to try and get to capitalist West. They're going from East Berlin to West Berlin, and they get on a plane to America or Britain or something. And it's doctors, it's teachers, it's people like that, people they need. So he's got a refugee problem. So how do you solve this problem? You build a wall. So overnight in 1961, they build a wall, and it's got a bit, you can see it's not a massive wall, not very thick. It's quite tall, obviously. And it was mainly this no man's land. If you tried to cross it, you were shot dead. Indeed, there's a very sad case of a man called Peter Fechter, who tried to escape, was shot by these Germans and left to die. And it was broadcast on live on Western TV to really show the horrors of it. And it went all the way around West Berlin, with the intention of stopping the East Berliners, East Germans, from trying to escape to West Berlin, to freedom, etc., etc. It stayed in place until 1989, so it was there for a long time, divided the city. And of course, if you watch my Cold War video in London, you'll see I go visit a remnant that you can still see in the Imperial Museum. What are the consequences of it? Well, divides a city in half. I think this is where relations are at their absolute worst. Khrushchev has full mistrust of the West, wants to keep blocking out. This Cold War in Europe perhaps reaches its apex in Europe, definitely. Maybe Cuban Missile Crisis we've got in the next one as well. It is bad news all round for humanity. I forgot to mention President Kennedy, of course. Actually, this brought interestingly, it brought a bit of time of peace in Europe, because they've got this wall now. It's kind of an act of war. That's it. It's going to be there. There's no conflict now. But Kennedy, he went to visit West Berlin, entirely circulated by this little bit of bastion of capitalism and freedom, circled by communist East Berlin. He went to visit, and he famously went and made a speech saying, "Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a donut." He announced to the world that he's a donut ready to fight for freedom. The second crisis to focus in on is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some people would say this is the high point, the apex of the Cold War, the part of the Cold War which got the closest to all-out conflict. Why is it so significant? Well, it revolves around the island of Cuba. Cuba is 90 miles from Florida, from the coast of America. It's very, very, very close. For many, many years, it had been a dictatorship run by a man called Batista, who was a dictator, not very nice man, but importantly for the Americans, he was not communist. So they quite liked that fact. 1959, there is a communist revolution in Cuba led by this man, Castro, Fidel Castro. He is the new communist leader of Cuba. Panic stations. America now, for a long time, communism and the Cold War has been far off, either in Asia or in Europe. Now suddenly it's on their front doorstep. More alarmingly is the Soviet Union has said, why not? We might put some missiles on Cuba. That might be good. Because America has missiles in Turkey and in Britain pointing at Moscow, the Russians, perhaps quite rightly, said, well, we're going to put some missiles here close to you, because the problem that the Russians had is their missiles were too far away to make any impact on any American city. Now with Cuba, communist, they can stick some nuclear bombs, get New York, Chicago, Washington, etc. pretty quick. Bad news. So the new US president, President Kennedy, who's just made his donut speech, but a similar time to that, he decided we need to stop this, we need to invade. And the first time they invaded was an absolute disaster. It's called the Bay of Pigs in 1961, Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs is on the south coast of Cuba. He had got a few specially trained American troops, and then he got a few Cuban exiles, people who had been kicked out of Cuba, to go in and try and raise again. The problem is, quite a few of those Cuban exiles were spies, and they simply forewarned the Castro and the communists. So when the Americans and these Cuban exiles landed in the Bay of Pigs, Castro and his troops were there waiting for him. It was a disaster. The new president looked weak, and Castro looked strong. So something needs to happen. Fast forward a few months later, about a year later actually, 1962, and the Soviet Union and America takes pictures, these pictures here, which do show that the Soviet Union is indeed building a missile base in Cuba. This cannot happen from the American perspective. They also get intelligence to suggest that a boat has left the Soviet Union and is going across the Atlantic, ready to get to Cuba. Panic stations all around. It's going to take 13 days to get there. So what America does, it encircles the whole of Cuba. Amazingly, it has enough ships to get a blockade right around Cuba. And essentially they said, if the boat with the nuclear bombs gets anywhere nearby, we will sink it. So it's a game of cat and mouse. Who's going to blink first? Is it going to be the Russians with their boat across the Atlantic? Is it the Americans ready to blockade? Messages are going between Khrushchev and Kennedy in a very antiquated way, telegrams taken for ages. Eventually, the Russians abort, and they blink, and they blink first, and they move away. They send enough messages. People have said, it's about a minute or 40 seconds or something before a deadline missed, and the world got 40 seconds away from nuclear war. Maybe that's true, I don't know. Consequences of this. Well, it's bad for Khrushchev, essentially. He looked weak, and indeed, just 2 years later, he's pushed out as leader of the Soviet Union. It's good for Kennedy, because he stood up to them, looked strong. Castro, well, he carries on being leader until 2016, so that's okay, but he doesn't get his Russian missiles. Did Khrushchev ultimately lose then? Because there was actually a secret deal made behind the scenes that didn't get onto the headlines, and that secret deal was that Americans agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey. So if one of Khrushchev's main aims was to counter the threat that the Americans had by their bombs pointed at them from Turkey, Khrushchev achieved that. They were removed. So maybe Khrushchev did win a little bit. I don't know, but Kennedy definitely won the propaganda war. The final crisis to look at is the Prague Spring of 1968. Czechoslovakia in 1968. Another Eastern European country that tries to take power away from the Soviets. This is very, very similar to the Hungarian Uprising in 1956, just with a few names changed. 1968, contextually, is actually a very interesting year in America. Civil rights movement, height of Vietnam War, a lot of protests, France, student protests. It was a time of upheaval, and it definitely was the case in Czechoslovakia. What had happened? Well, Czechoslovakia had, like Hungary, had a new leader, a man called Dubček. Dubček, he came in and he asked the Soviet Union, can we have better trade with the West? Can we have better relations? With the West? Can we have democracy? Can we have freedom of speech? Can we have trade unions? Can you imagine the Soviet reaction? No way, Jose. So how do the Soviets react? They send in 500,000 troops, including on tanks, into Prague to really suppress this uprising. So exactly the same as Hungary, really. West don't do anything, look weak. Soviet Union looks strong. Two interesting points to talk about is Soviet Union has a new leader, a man called Brezhnev, took over from Khrushchev. He's famous for having extraordinary eyebrows. He needs to prove himself like Khrushchev did. So the best way to prove yourself, crush a rebellion. The other thing is he did it the day after, or maybe a week after, the leaders of Yugoslavia and Bulgaria had just come to visit, Romania, Ceausescu, and Tito of Yugoslavia had just visited Prague. visited Dubček, and Dubček said, look, could we get these things? It would be nice. Brezhnev comes in as a warning to Romania and Yugoslavia. Don't even try it, Sonny Jim. Look what I can do to Czechoslovakia. So an interesting time, similar to Hungary, but it's time in Czechoslovakia a bit later, 68. And the final chapter of our Cold War studies takes us up to 1972, and it is Détente and the thaw and the role of China. It is pronounced détente, not detente, as someone has said before to me. Détente is where we get the word detention from, to hold back, to bring back from the brink, because it came about after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world had got so close to nuclear war, they thought, come on guys, we better chill out here. Let's try and make things a little bit better. So they did a few practical things. One is the red hotline, the phone that was on the White House desk, and it went to the Kremlin. It meant that the President of the United States could pick up the phone and could immediately speak to the leader of the Soviet Union. This because, remember, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was ridiculous messages being sent on in telegrams to Khrushchev, between Khrushchev and Kennedy. Didn't quite work. What did détente look like? Well, it looked a lot like treaties, various different things. There was the Outer Space Treaty, no war in the space, please. There was the Comprehensive Test Ban and the Limited Test Ban treaties, trying to limit the amount of nuclear weapons, etc. And essentially they had meetings between Americans and the Soviets to say, shall we just chill it all out a little bit? The important thing to know about détente is the reasons why. Well, there's obvious reasons they don't want more war, but both countries were looking for détente for basically the same reason. They were spending way too much money on defense. The Soviet Union, with its industrial complex, could barely keep up with America with all the creation of these nuclear weapons and technology. So they would have been very happy to say, let's do less. America is fighting a war in Vietnam. Very, very bad, and it's going very, very badly. So they've got that interested. They're trying to pay for the moon landing, which is about to happen in 1969. And they've also, President Lyndon B. Johnson had launched a big thing called the Great Society, Medicare, and various different, a form of welfare state, not quite, because this is America, which essentially was draining a lot of resources and a lot of his time. Plus there's the civil rights movement, distraction, etc., etc., etc. So both sides were keen to look onto that. The only other thing to really mention about détente, by the time we get to the early 1970s, we have a new US president, a man called Richard Milhous Nixon, who was a Republican and was very keen to stop spending too much money. He becomes friend, weirdly, with Chairman Mao of China from our China studies. Now, for a long time, you would have thought that communist China were friends with communist Russia, but Mao and Stalin did not get on, and they mistrusted each other. So Nixon saw an opportunity in there to get in there and make relations and start good. And those relations with America were quite interesting. They started off with a table tennis contest, ping pong diplomacy. The Americans visited, played table tennis, etc. All very nice. It looked great. Henry Kissinger, who just died, he went over and visited. And finally, Nixon went to the Great Wall of China, had a wonderful time. And this is the Soviet Union would be thinking, China should be my ally, but now America's making friends. Maybe we should come up with a bit of a deal. And they do come up with an agreement called SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, very comprehensive treaty to limit the amount of nuclear weapons and have better relations. That is where our Cold War studies finish. Some people who might study more Cold War might go on all the way to the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, but for this video and for us, we are going to end it there, 1972. Stay tuned. Please subscribe to see more. I'm going to be doing the Stalin course. I'm going to be doing the Tsar and Russian Revolution, and I'll do one on China as well. So please join me on the next one. Don't forget to subscribe.